My son's voice, usually a warm melody that had been the soundtrack of my life for 19 years, was a cold blade over the phone. "You're a disgrace," he said, the words clipping off sharp and clean. "Dad was right about you. Just don't call me again." The click of the line disconnecting was louder than any gunshot I could imagine. 51 years old, divorced, homeless, and now disowned. I thought I had hit rock bottom, but I was wrong. The bottom, I was learning, had a basement. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe and support our channel. Just 18 months ago, that boy, my Jacob, had been sitting at our kitchen island, laughing as I tried to flip a pancake too early, sending batter splattering across the stove. My life then was a collection of such beautifully ordinary moments. I was Eleanor Vance, 51 years old, a mother of two, a wife of 25 years, and the quiet architect of a happy home in a leafy suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Our house, a 2-story colonial with a porch swing Richard and I had installed on our 10th anniversary, was my sanctuary. It wasn't just a structure of wood and plaster. It was a living album of our family, its walls saturated with the echoes of first steps, birthday parties, and the low hum of a contented life. I had been a registered nurse for 7 years before Lily was born, a job I loved for its sense of purpose, for the quiet satisfaction of easing someone's pain. But when we decided to start a family, Richard and I agreed that I would stay home. "I want our kids to have what I never did," he'd said, his hand over mine, "a mom who's always there." It was a sacrifice I made gladly, pouring all the energy I once gave my patients into my children and my husband, building a world for them that felt safe and unshakable. The unraveling didn't happen with a sudden snap, but with a slow, almost imperceptible fraying at the edges. It began about 5 years ago, when Richard made partner at his accounting firm. The success that should have brought us closer, instead, seemed to install a pane of soundproof glass between us. He started working later, his dinners growing cold on the table. When he was home, he was distant, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of his phone, a device that had become a third party in our marriage. "It's just work, Ellie," he'd say, a new sharpness in his voice I didn't recognize. "You wouldn't understand the pressure." He started to subtly belittle my world, the one he had asked me to create. Parent-teacher conferences were small-town dramas. My volunteer work at the local hospice was a depressing hobby, and our life together was comfortable, but not ambitious. The word hung in the air between us, a judgment on the quiet life I cherished. He began comparing us to his new, wealthier colleagues, whose wives had their own careers or managed charities, women who vacationed in Tuscany and wore clothes I only saw in magazines. I tried to ignore the growing chill, blaming it on his stress, telling myself that all long marriages hit these lulls. But the distance became a chasm the night of our 25th anniversary. I had cooked his favorite meal, osso buco, a dish that took all day to prepare. I wore the dress he'd bought me years ago, the one he always said made my eyes look bluer. He came home 3 hours late, smelling of expensive whiskey and a perfume that wasn't mine. He didn't notice the meal, the dress, or the single candle I'd lit on the table. He just dropped his briefcase by the door and announced he was tired and going to bed. The next morning, I found a receipt in his pocket for 2 glasses of champagne and a dessert described as the lover's delight from a hotel bar downtown. When I confronted him, his face wasn't apologetic or even guilty. It was annoyed, as if I had broken some unspoken rule by looking. "Her name is Tiffany," he said, as casually as if discussing a new client. "She's an associate at the firm. And frankly, Ellie, she sees me for who I am, not just as a walking ATM and a handyman." The divorce was a masterclass in character assassination. Richard, the man I had spent half my life with, sat across a polished mahogany table in a lawyer's office and methodically dismantled the woman he had promised to cherish. His lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, argued that my decision to be a stay-at-home mother wasn't a mutual choice for our family, but a sign of my lack of drive and contribution. They painted me as a spendthrift wife who lived off her husband's hard work, conveniently ignoring the budgets I managed, the second-hand clothes I bought for the kids, the vacations we skipped, so we could pay down the mortgage faster. They used my volunteer work at the hospice against me, twisting it into a morbid fascination that made me an emotionally unstable presence in the home. The man who had once praised my compassion now called it a weakness. The judge, a woman who seemed impressed by Richard's calm demeanor and financial charts, awarded him the house, the majority of our savings, and ordered me to pay him a token alimony from my future earnings. A final, cruel joke on a woman who hadn't worked in 2 decades. The cruelest blow, however, came from my own children. Jacob was already away at college and tried to stay neutral, but Lily, my sweet Lily, who was then a junior in high school, became her father's staunchest ally. He had convinced her that my unhappiness was the reason for the divorce, that I had smothered him with my neediness and held him back from his true potential. "Mom, Dad just wants to be happy," she told me one afternoon, her eyes cold and distant as she packed a bag to go live with him and Tiffany in my house. "Why do you have to be so difficult? He said you chose this life, that you could have been a successful nurse, but you were too afraid to try." Her words, a twisted echo of her father's lies, shattered what little was left of my heart. Within a month of the divorce being finalized, I was in a small, damp apartment, the smell of mildew a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. The money from my share of the settlement dwindled with alarming speed. I tried to find work, but my nursing certification had expired, and my skills were 2 decades out of date. Age discrimination is a quiet, polite poison, and at 51, I was either overqualified or underqualified for everything. My car was repossessed on a Tuesday morning while I was at a fruitless job interview. 3 months later, the eviction notice was taped to my door. The last of my pride crumbled as I sold my mother's wedding ring for $200, enough for a bus ticket to nowhere and a few days' worth of food. The first night, I found myself in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the downtown bus terminal, clutching a single backpack with everything I owned. I had become one of them. The invisible people you pretend not to see, the ones you hope don't sit next to you. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, mother and wife. I was just another homeless woman, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been my own. The 3rd month on the streets was a brutal teacher. I learned a new kind of arithmetic, the calculus of survival. I learned that the dumpster behind Giuliani's bakery was better than the one behind the steakhouse, because the bakery threw out their day-old bread at precisely 6 a.m., and it was often still wrapped in clean paper. I learned that a discarded appliance box, flattened and folded, provided better insulation from the frozen ground than 7 layers of newspaper. I learned to sleep with one eye open, my backpack clutched to my chest like a child, my senses tuned to the sound of approaching footsteps. At 51, I had become an expert in the geography of refuse and the subtle etiquette of invisibility. The city I had once navigated with a shopping list and a school pickup schedule was now a map of dangers and small opportunities. Which church basements offered a hot meal without a sermon, which public libraries didn't kick you out for sleeping in a chair, which underpasses were relatively safe from the predators who preyed on the vulnerable. My only tether to humanity was Maria, a woman in her late 60s with eyes that had seen everything and a laugh that sounded like gravel in a tin can. She'd been on the streets for 15 years, ever since her husband died and his children from a first marriage had sold their house out from under her. Maria was the one who found me crying behind a bus station my first week, a raw, open wound of despair. She didn't offer pity. Instead, she handed me a dry pair of socks and a piece of hard cheese. "Tears will just make you colder, honey," she'd said, her voice raspy but not unkind. And looking like a victim is an invitation to become one. You gotta get hard, or you'll get dead. She taught me how to read the city, how to find the cracks where someone like me could exist. She was my gruff, unwilling guardian angel, and in the unspoken sisterhood of the dispossessed, she was the closest thing I had to family. We looked out for each other, sharing information, food, and the grim, silent understanding of our shared predicament. That October morning began with a frost so sharp it felt like needles in my bones. The thin coat I'd found in a charity donation bin a month earlier was losing its battle against the coming winter, and a deep, gnawing hunger made the world feel tilted and unreal. I was behind Giuliani's, my favorite spot, my hands numb as I reached into the large metal bin. My fingers brushed against a bag of bagels, probably onion or everything by the smell. A small victory that felt as monumental as any I had ever achieved. I had just pulled the bag out, clutching my prize, when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the shuffle of another homeless person or the heavy tread of a security guard. It was a crisp, rhythmic click-clack on the wet asphalt. The sound of expensive shoes, walking with a purpose that was utterly alien to this alley of desperation. I froze, my body tensing for a confrontation, my mind racing through the possibilities. A cop, a new business owner about to chase me off, someone looking for trouble. Eleanor Vance. The voice was calm, professional, and unnervingly precise. Eleanor Marie Vance. I turned slowly, the bag of bagels still in my hand, a pathetic treasure I was ready to defend. The man standing there was an apparition from another universe. He looked as though he had stepped out of the pages of a magazine about wealth and power. He was in his 60s, with a full head of silver hair perfectly styled against the wind. He wore a dark gray cashmere coat over a tailored suit and a pair of polished leather shoes that probably cost more than my first car. In his hand, he held a gleaming leather briefcase. He didn't look disgusted or angry, just observant, as if he were a zoologist studying a strange creature in its unnatural habitat. "Who's asking?" My voice came out as a harsh croak, a stranger's voice I barely recognized as my own. 3 months of shouting to be heard over street traffic and whispering so as not to be noticed had shredded my vocal cords. "My name is Alistair Finch. I am an estate attorney from New York City." He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if he knew any sudden movement might make me bolt. He reached inside his coat, and I flinched, my heart hammering against my ribs. But instead of a badge or a weapon, he pulled out a photograph in a plastic sleeve. "Is this you?" he asked, holding it out. The world stopped spinning. The photo was from about 10 years ago, taken at a hospital charity gala. I was wearing a navy blue dress. My hair was styled, and I was smiling, my arm linked through Richard's. I looked happy, healthy, and completely oblivious to the fault line running beneath my life. I looked like a woman who had never known a moment of real fear or hunger. The chasm between the woman in the photo and the shivering creature standing in a filthy alley was so vast I felt a wave of vertigo. "Where did you get that?" I whispered, the question barely audible. "Your great-aunt, Genevieve Dubois, passed away last month in her Manhattan apartment," he said, his expression unchanging. "Before her death, she engaged my firm to maintain current records on all her living relatives. You became difficult to locate after you lost your permanent address." Aunt Genevieve. The name conjured a faint, dusty memory from my childhood. A tall, eccentric woman who wore too much perfume, spoke with a slight European accent, and sent me $5 bills in my birthday cards until I turned 18. I hadn't heard from her or about her in over 30 years. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I haven't spoken to Aunt Genevieve since I was a teenager. Why in God's name would she be looking for me? Mr. Finch's gaze softened for the briefest of moments. "Because, Mrs. Vance, she has named you as the sole beneficiary of her entire estate." The plastic bag of bagels slipped from my numb fingers and landed on the wet ground with a soft thud. It was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard. "That's a lie," I managed to say, This is some kind of sick joke, a scam. Though, even as I said it, the absurdity of the idea struck me. What could they possibly steal from me? The duct tape holding my shoes together? The half-eaten granola bar in my pocket? I assure you, it is neither a joke nor a scam, he said, opening his pristine briefcase with a quiet click. Miss Dubois' estate includes her penthouse on Park Avenue, valued at $15 million. A collection of early 20th century art, recently appraised at $9 million. A portfolio of stocks and bonds, currently valued at approximately $23 million. He paused, letting the impossible numbers hang in the cold, damp air. After estate taxes and fees, the total value of your inheritance is approximately $47 million. I grabbed the cold, greasy rim of the dumpster to keep myself from falling. $47 million. The words had no meaning. Yesterday, I had considered it a good day because I found a half-full bottle of water. Today, this man in a cashmere coat was telling me I was one of the wealthiest women in the country. The whiplash was so violent I felt like I was going to be sick. My mind, malnourished and battered by months of stress, refused to process the information. $47 million. The number was a foreign language, a concept as alien as quantum physics. I stared at the man, Alistair Finch, convinced he was a mirage, a symptom of the dizzying hunger that had been my constant companion. "This is a hallucination," I said, the words coming out in a puff of white air. "I'm starving, and I'm seeing things." "You're not real." My voice held a note of desperate pleading, because the alternative that this was real, and I was being subjected to the cruelest prank in human history, was too much to bear. I expected him to mock me, to laugh at the pathetic creature before him. Instead, his expression remained one of immense, unruffled patience. He seemed to understand that my sanity was a fragile thing, a ship being tossed on a violent sea, and he was the calm, steady lighthouse in the storm. "Mrs. Vance, I understand your skepticism. It is not only warranted, it is entirely logical," he said, his voice a soothing baritone. He knelt, placing his expensive briefcase on a relatively clean patch of pavement, and clicked it open again. He withdrew a sheaf of papers, held in a slim leather portfolio. "I have, of course, brought documentation." He handed me the first sheet. It was a copy of his credentials from the New York State Bar Association, his photograph clear and professional. The next was a notarized copy of Genevieve Dubois' death certificate, the official seal, raised and cold beneath my trembling, grimy fingertips. The last was a letter, on heavy cream-colored letterhead, bearing the name of his firm, Blackstone, Finch, and Associates, outlining his authority as the executor of the estate. The paper itself felt foreign, impossibly smooth and heavy in my hands, which were calloused and chapped from the cold. "My firm has managed the Dubois estate for over 40 years. We are not in the business of playing pranks." Just as a tiny, fragile seed of belief began to sprout in the barren soil of my despair, he spoke again, and the world tilted once more. "There is, however, a condition attached to the inheritance." Of course there was. There it was. The other shoe, hanging by a thread, finally dropping. The universe didn't give out miracles, not to people like me. It only offered bargains with hidden clauses and impossible terms. My nascent hope shriveled and died. "I knew it," I rasped, a bitter taste rising in my throat. "What is it? Do I have to bark like a dog? Humiliate myself on a stage for some sick, rich person's amusement?" "Mr." Finch actually winced, a flicker of genuine distress crossing his features. "Good heavens, no. Nothing of the sort. Miss Dubois's conditions are unconventional, but they are not cruel. However, her instructions were explicit. I am legally prohibited from discussing the terms with you here. You must come to New York. You must hear them in her penthouse, as she stipulated." He glanced at his watch, a slim, elegant gold piece that caught the weak morning light. "I must also inform you of the timeline. You have 72 hours from this moment to travel to New York and hear the terms. If you refuse, or if you fail to appear within the designated time." He paused, his gaze steady and direct, and I knew the worst was coming. "Then the entire estate, all $47 million, transfers immediately to the designated alternate beneficiary." A cold dread, colder than any winter frost, washed over me. I had a feeling I knew who it was, the person whose name would inflict the maximum possible pain. "Who?" I whispered. He took a deep breath. "Your ex-husband, Mr. Richard Vance." The name hit me with the force of a physical blow. I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth as a wave of nausea swept over me. Richard. The man who had stripped me of my home, my dignity, and my daughter's love. The man who had told a judge I was an unstable leech. The thought of him and Tiffany, inheriting that fortune, a fortune that was almost mine, was a vision straight from hell. It was a torment so exquisite, it could only have been designed by a truly diabolical mind. My great-aunt, it seemed, was not just eccentric, she was a master of psychological warfare. Mr. Vance's recent financial and personal difficulties are a matter of public record, Mr. Finch continued, his tone carefully neutral. Miss Dubois was very thorough in her research. The implication was clear. Richard was likely in trouble, and this money would be his salvation. My failure would be his ultimate victory. The injustice of it was so profound it burned away my fear and my disbelief, leaving behind a hard, cold knot of fury. Seeing my expression, Mr. Finch extended an offer that was both a lifeline and a test. "I have a car waiting at the end of the alley. We can be at the airport in 20 minutes. Whatever you decide about the inheritance, Mrs. Vance, at least allow me to offer you a warm place to sit, a hot meal, a chance to feel like yourself again, if only for a day." I looked at my surroundings, the stinking dumpster, the discarded bagels on the wet ground, the grimy alley that had been my home. Then I looked at the promise of a warm car. I thought of Maria, and a sharp pang of guilt shot through me. I couldn't leave her without a word. "Give me an hour," I said, my voice firmer now. "I have to tell someone I'm leaving." He nodded, a gesture of profound respect. "Of course, the car will be waiting. Finding Maria, telling her a story about a long-lost cousin, offering me a couch to sleep on a lie that tasted like ash but was necessary, and giving her the $20 I had sewn into the lining of my coat was the hardest part. Her hug was brief and wiry, a silent wish for my safety. An hour later, I was sliding into the back of a black luxury sedan. The heated leather seat felt like an impossible indulgence, a warmth that seemed to penetrate all the way to my bones. The ride to the private airfield was silent and surreal. At a terminal I never knew existed, a place without lines or crowds, Mr. Finch led me to a private lounge. "The shower facilities are through here," he said gently. "I took the liberty of having some clothes delivered. We estimated your size from your old driver's license records." That shower was a resurrection. I stood under the scalding water for a full 30 minutes, watching the filth and grime of the last 3 months swirl down the drain. I washed my hair 3 times, scrubbing away the smell of the street, of desperation. When I looked in the mirror, my face was gaunt and my eyes were haunted. But they were my own. The clothes, simple dark trousers, a soft cashmere sweater, a warm coat fit perfectly. They felt like a costume, but a costume of a woman I desperately wanted to be again. The private jet was another layer of unreality. As we ascended into the clouds, leaving the gray landscape of my misery behind, a flight attendant offered me coffee and a sandwich. Real coffee, served in a porcelain cup. The sandwich was on fresh bread, with roasted turkey and crisp lettuce. I ate slowly, carefully, my shrunken stomach cramping in protest. I forced myself to finish it. a conscious act of reclaiming a life where food was not a desperate gamble but a simple pleasure. As we flew east, I found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my mind. "Tell me about her," I said to Mr. Finch. "My great-aunt Genevieve, the real her." He considered the question for a long moment, steepling his fingers. "Genevieve Dubois was the most formidable person I have ever known," he began. "She was brilliant, eccentric, and by the end of her life, profoundly solitary. She built her fortune in the world of rare art and antiquities, but her true gift was an almost supernatural ability to see the truth of things, the authenticity of a painting, and the character of the person selling it." He paused, looking out the small window at the endless expanse of clouds. "She believed that money was a tool, but a dangerous one. She often said that unearned wealth was more corrosive to the human soul than poverty. She was watching you, Eleanor. She was watching everyone in the family. She knew everything, and she chose you for a reason. Somewhere below us, in a city of impossible dreams, a dead woman I barely knew had laid out a test for me. A test with $47 million on one side and my ex-husband's triumphant laughter on the other. The journey from the airport into the heart of Manhattan was a disorienting plunge into a different reality. The sheer scale of the city, the canyons of glass and steel that clawed at the sky, made me feel infinitesimally small. The Lincoln sedan moved through the chaotic symphony of traffic with an insulated grace, delivering us to a limestone building on Park Avenue that looked more like a palace than an apartment block. A doorman in a crisp, dark green uniform greeted Mr. Finch by name and held the heavy glass door open for us, his eyes gliding over me with a polite, practiced indifference that was somehow more unnerving than the outright disgust I'd grown used to on the streets. We didn't walk through the lobby, but were escorted to a small, wood-paneled elevator. Mr. Finch produced a brass key, and the elevator ascended in a smooth, silent rush, the doors opening not into a hallway, but directly into the penthouse itself. The first thing that hit me was the light. It poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the entire apartment, framing a breathtaking, godlike view of Central Park. Its autumn colors a vibrant tapestry spread out below. The space was immense, a cavern of quiet, intimidating luxury. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and money. It was a place built to impress, not to comfort. Original paintings lined the walls, and even with my untrained eye, I recognized the soft, dreamlike strokes of a Monet and the sharp, angular energy of a Picasso. The furniture was all dark wood and rich leather, arranged with a geometric precision that felt more like a museum exhibit than a living room. It was the home of someone who collected beautiful things but had forgotten how to live among them. Mr. Finch led me through the cavernous rooms to what he called the library. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high, with thousands of leather-bound volumes lining the walls from floor to ceiling, accessible by a rolling brass ladder. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen, and also the loneliest. This was the fortress my great-aunt had built for herself, a beautiful prison of her own design. "Her study is this way," Mr. Finch said, his voice soft, as if he were in a church. The study was the heart of the fortress, dominated by a massive mahogany desk that was clear of any personal effects, save for a single ornate letter opener. And there, mounted on the wall opposite the desk, was a large, black television screen, a starkly modern object in a room steeped in the past. Mr. Finch gestured to a single, high-backed leather chair, positioned directly in front of it. "Miss Dubois recorded a message for you. Her instructions were very specific. It will play only once, with no exceptions. I will be in the living room. Please take all the time you need afterward." He pressed a small button on a remote control. The screen flickered to life, and then he was gone, leaving me alone with the ghost in the machine. The face that appeared on the screen was one I vaguely recognized from the hazy memories of childhood, but it had been ravaged by time and illness. It was Aunt Genevieve. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched like parchment over her sharp cheekbones, but her eyes were a force of nature. They were a piercing, intelligent blue, and they burned with an intensity that the cancer consuming her body could not touch. She was propped up in a bed, wearing an elegant silk bed jacket, a startling contrast to her frail condition. "Hello, Eleanor," she said, and her voice was stronger than I expected, a low, cultured rasp. "If you are watching this, it means Alistair found you. I imagine you are not in the best of circumstances. My investigator's last report placed you behind a bakery in Columbus, surviving on discarded bread. Do not look so shocked. I have been watching all of my relatives for years. Most of them are greedy, vapid fools. But you were the one I was waiting for to break." She leaned forward slightly, and I found myself mirroring the movement, drawn in by the sheer force of her will. "I have left you my entire fortune, $47 million. But it is not a gift, it is a responsibility. The inheritance is yours, Eleanor, on one single condition. Within the next 5 years, you must find 100 women who are in the same position you were in this morning, homeless, invisible, and discarded, and you must give them a genuine path back to a life of dignity. Not a handout, not a temporary shelter. A real, sustainable second chance. Jobs, housing, medical care, therapy, whatever it takes. Alistair's firm will establish a trust to oversee and verify your work. If you succeed, everything is yours to do with as you please. If you refuse, or if you fail to help 100 women in 5 years, every last penny goes to that worthless, contemptible man you used to call your husband." I felt the air leave my lungs. 100 women. I thought of Maria, of the other women I'd seen in shelters, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. "You are wondering why," Genevieve continued, as if reading my mind. "Why this strange, elaborate test? Because in the winter of 1968, I was you." Her eyes looked past the camera, into a distant, painful memory. "I had a husband I adored, and a 4-year-old son with a laugh like wind chimes. We were driving home from a Christmas party. There was black ice. I was the only one who survived. I broke. Something inside me simply shattered. I walked away from my life, from my concerned relatives and their empty platitudes, and I disappeared into the streets of New York. For 2 years, I was a ghost, sleeping in alleyways, eating from garbage cans, waiting to die." She paused, taking a sip of water from a glass beside her bed. "One night, delirious with pneumonia, I collapsed in a snow-covered doorway. I was dying. A young woman found me. She was a nursing student, working 2 jobs to get by. She could have called an ambulance and walked away, but she didn't. She and her roommate carried me up to their tiny apartment. They fed me soup, cleaned my wounds, and called a doctor they knew who would treat me without asking questions. She saved my life, but more than that, she saved my soul. She spoke to me with kindness, without an ounce of judgment." Genevieve's piercing eyes found the camera again, and they were glistening with unshed tears. "That young woman's name was Clara Jensen, your mother." I let out a strangled sob, my hand covering my mouth. My mother. She had died 10 years ago, and I missed her every single day. "I never told her who I really was," Genevieve confessed. "But when I finally pulled myself together and reclaimed my life, I started watching our family from a distance. I watched your cousins become greedy social climbers. I watched your brother hoard his money while his own parents struggled. I watched Richard, that peacock of a man, charm his way through life, leaving a trail of broken promises. And I watched you. My investigators brought me stories that broke my heart and gave me hope. They told me about the time you found a half-eaten sandwich and gave the larger piece to an elderly woman who was crying from hunger. They told me you used your last $10 to buy antibiotics for your friend, Maria, when her leg became infected, even though you had a fever yourself. You, who had nothing, gave what little you had. You have your mother's heart, Eleanor. You kept your humanity when you had every reason to let it die. She leaned back against her pillows, exhausted by the effort. But I am giving you this warning. I built a fortune from that second chance your mother gave me, but I also built a fortress around my heart. I never trusted anyone again. I never let anyone get close. I am dying in this magnificent apartment, surrounded by priceless treasures, and I am completely, utterly alone. Do not become me, Eleanor. Take the money. Save those 100 women. But in doing so, save yourself. Rebuild your life. But do it with an open heart. This isn't a test of your ability to manage money. It's a test of your ability to heal. The screen went dark, then lit up with a final line of text. You have 24 hours to decide. But I already know your answer. You are Clara's daughter. The screen went black for good. I sat there, in the deafening silence of that opulent room, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't a test. It was a legacy. It was a circle of kindness, started by my mother 50 years ago, now coming back to me. When Mr. Finch entered the room a few minutes later, I stood up, my body still shaking, but my mind clear for the first time in months. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steady. "I'll do it for my mother. And for them." The first few weeks were a dizzying blur of legalities and logistics. I sat in Mr. Finch's glass-walled conference room, overlooking the sprawling green expanse of Central Park, signing documents whose legal jargon swam before my eyes. Trusts were established, accounts were opened, and the abstract, impossible number of $47 million became a concrete reality on a bank statement. It felt like being handed the keys to a spaceship without a single lesson on how to fly it. But through all the meetings, one thought remained, my North Star, Maria. The money meant nothing if it couldn't first serve the person who had shown me kindness when I was at my most broken. I named the organization the Clara's Circle Foundation, a tribute to the mother whose quiet act of compassion had set this incredible chain of events in motion. And my first official act as its founder was to book a flight back to Columbus. I hired a car service, a discreet black town car, and spent 2 days searching. I drove through the familiar, painful geography of my homeless life, my heart aching with a mixture of dread and hope. I checked the library, the church basement, the underpass where we sometimes slept on dry nights. Finally, on the third morning, I found her. She was in the alley behind Giuliani's bakery, the very place where my life had been reborn, sorting through a pile of newspapers to use for insulation. She looked thinner, wearier. When she saw me get out of the car, clean and dressed in a warm coat, her face hardened with a mixture of suspicion and hurt. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, not looking at me. "Decided to slum it for the day?" The words were a slap, but I understood the pain behind them. I had disappeared, leaving only a flimsy story and a $20 bill. "Maria, I'm so sorry," I said, sitting on an overturned milk crate next to her, ignoring the dirt. I couldn't tell you the truth because I barely believed it myself. And so I told her everything, the whole insane, impossible story of the great aunt, the inheritance, the penthouse, and the condition. She listened in stunned silence, her sharp eyes searching my face for any hint of a lie. When I finished, she just shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "I always knew you weren't meant for this life, Ellie," she whispered, "but I never imagined." I took a deep breath. "That's why I'm here. Maria, I can't do this without you. I have the money, but you have the knowledge. You know these streets. You know what people really need, not what some government report says they need. I want to hire you. I want you to be the first employee of Clara's Circle, our outreach director." She stared at me, her mouth agape. "A job? Honey, I'm a 68-year-old homeless woman. My resume is a blank piece of paper." I took her rough, calloused hand in mine. "Your resume is the 15 years you've survived out here. It's every person you've helped, every piece of advice you've given. You have a PhD in survival, and that's more valuable to me than any degree. I need you." Within a month, we had leased a small, unassuming storefront in a neighborhood riddled with poverty and homelessness. Maria's first directive changed the entire model of what I thought we would be. "No soup kitchen lines," she'd said firmly. "No making people feel like beggars. The first thing you lose out here isn't your home, it's your dignity. We have to give them that back first." So we created a space that felt like a community center, not a charity. We had a clean, warm reception area with comfortable chairs and free coffee. The first door on the right led to clean, private bathrooms with showers. We didn't have caseworkers behind plexiglass. We had advocates who sat down with each person, cup of coffee in hand, and simply asked, "What do you need to feel safe today?" We offered a menu of choices, not a one-size-fits-all program. For some, it was a bus ticket back to a family they were too ashamed to call. For others, it was immediate placement in a drug rehabilitation program. For many, it was simply the security deposit on an apartment and a few months' rent to give them the breathing room to find a job. The third person we helped was a woman named Agnes, who was 72 years old and slept on a bench in the park. She reminded me so much of my own mother it hurt to look at her. We discovered she was entitled to Social Security and a small pension from her late husband that she had no idea how to access. Within a week, with legal help funded by the foundation, we had her benefits reinstated and found her a lovely small apartment in a senior living community. The day we moved her in, she held my hand and cried for a solid hour. "I thought that park bench was the last bed I would ever have," she sobbed. I thought my story was over. By the end of our first 6 months, we had helped 37 women find a path off the streets. Each story was a victory, a small ripple of hope spreading outward. Mr. Finch's firm meticulously documented each case, but the real proof was in the lives that were beginning to bloom again. And that's when Richard showed up. He was waiting for me one evening as I locked up the foundation's office. I almost didn't recognize him. The confident, arrogant man I had known was gone, replaced by a ghost. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His face was pale and puffy, and his eyes had the same haunted, desperate look I remembered seeing in my own reflection. The smug superiority had been replaced by a raw, hollowed-out fear. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a weak imitation of its former self, "I heard about what you're doing. It's incredible." I stood there, my keys in my hand, and felt nothing. The old, familiar ache in my chest was gone. The anger had cooled to ashes. I was just looking at a stranger. "What do you want, Richard?" His story came tumbling out, a pathetic litany of failures. Tiffany had left him for a wealthier man, but not before maxing out his credit cards and draining their joint account. A series of bad investments, the same ones he used to mock me for not understanding, had backfired spectacularly. His firm had forced him out, and the house, my house, was in foreclosure. "I was a fool, Ellie," he said, trying to take my hand, but I instinctively pulled it away. "I was arrogant and cruel. I see that now. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it all away." He was trying to play the part of the repentant husband, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry for where it had gotten him. "I heard about your aunt's money," he finally admitted, unable to meet my gaze. "I thought, maybe, for the sake of the kids, you could help me out. Alone, just to get back on my feet." The old Eleanor, The one who had spent 25 years soothing his ego and cleaning up his messes might have been swayed. But that woman had died in a bus station 3 months ago. I looked at him, at the architect of my deepest pain, and I felt a profound, quiet pity. The foundation, I said, my voice calm and even, is for women experiencing homelessness. You are not a woman, and you are not yet homeless. Therefore, you do not qualify for our services. His face fell, the mask of contrition slipping to reveal a flash of his old, entitled anger. But Eleanor, after everything we had, I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card. This is a very good employment agency, I said, holding it out to him. They help executives who are transitioning between careers. I'm sure they can help you polish your resume. He stared at the card as if I had handed him a snake. He had come expecting a multi-million-dollar bailout, and I was offering him career counseling. Without another word, he turned and walked away, a man defeated not by my anger, but by my indifference. I didn't feel happy or triumphant. I just felt free. The final chain had been broken. The years that followed were a testament to the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. The Clara's Circle Foundation became a fixture in the community, a place known not just for the resources it offered, but for the respect with which it treated every person who walked through its doors. Maria, with her gruff wisdom and encyclopedic knowledge of the streets, became a celebrated figure in the city's social services network, a respected expert who spoke at conferences about the importance of dignity in outreach. We didn't save everyone. There were heartbreaking failures, women who relapsed, who vanished back into the shadows, who weren't ready for the change we offered. Each one left a scar on my heart, a painful reminder that you cannot want a new life for someone more than they want it for themselves. But the successes, the 86 women we had helped find stability by the end of year 3, were the fuel that kept us going. They were teachers, cashiers, mothers who had been reunited with their children, women who were now living quiet, ordinary, beautiful lives. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 3 months after our 3rd anniversary, when my personal phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. Mom? The voice was hesitant, fragile, a voice I hadn't heard in almost 4 years. It was my daughter, Lily. My heart seized in my chest, a painful clench of love and loss. I had sent her letters, birthday cards, but they had all gone unanswered. I had resigned myself to the fact that I had lost her forever. Lily, I breathed, my hand trembling. Hi, sweetheart. There was a long silence, filled with the sound of her shaky breath. I saw an article, she said finally. It was about your foundation, about what you're doing for those women. It talked about Grandma Clara. Oh? Her voice broke on her grandmother's name. Dad, after he lost everything, he changed. He became this bitter, angry person. Everything was someone else's fault. He started saying these awful things, and I finally realized he had been saying awful things about you all along. He told me you left us, that you were unstable, that you didn't care. I was a kid, and I believed him. She was openly sobbing now, a sound that tore through me. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was so stupid and so cruel. I should have known better. You were always the kindest person I knew. The dam of my own carefully constructed composure broke, and tears I didn't know I was still holding streamed down my face. Oh, Lily, you were a child. He was your father. It's not your fault. I never, ever blamed you. It was the truest thing I had ever said. Later that week, she asked if she could come to the foundation. Not for money or anything, she said quickly. I want to see it. I want to see what you've built. Maybe I could volunteer? That's how I got my daughter back. Not with a share of my inheritance, but with a volunteer apron and a job sorting donated clothes. She came every Saturday, and at first, We were awkward and shy around each other, two strangers trying to relearn a familiar dance. But slowly, through the shared work of helping others, the ice began to melt. I saw in her a deep, innate well of compassion that was so reminiscent of my own mother. She had a gift for connecting with the younger women, the runaways and the castaways who saw a friend in her, not an authority figure. One afternoon, I watched her sitting with a terrified teenage girl who had just arrived, listening to her story with a look of such profound, gentle empathy. In that moment, watching my daughter comfort a stranger, I felt the broken pieces of my own heart finally begin to knit themselves back together. My life was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what was being restored. Near the end of the 4th year, with our 97th success story happily settled in a new apartment, I received an urgent call from Mr. Finch. His voice, usually so calm and measured, was filled with an uncharacteristic excitement. "Eleanor, you need to come to New York," he said. "We've been clearing out the last of Genevieve's storage units. We found her personal journals." A week later, I was sitting in his office, a stack of worn, leather-bound books on the table in front of me. He had marked a specific page. The entry was dated February 10th, 1969. Genevieve's elegant script was clear and precise. "The young woman who took me in, the nursing student. Her name is Clara Jensen. There is a light in her that I thought had been extinguished from the world. She asks for nothing, yet she has given me everything: warmth, safety, and a reason to believe in humanity again. I owe her a debt that can never be repaid." It was a powerful confirmation of the story she had told me, a tangible piece of the past that connected me to her and to my mother. "There's more," Mr. Finch said, his eyes gleaming. He pushed a slim archival box across the table. This was tucked inside the back cover of that same journal. My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside was a small stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the top envelope was instantly, achingly familiar. It was my mother's. They were letters she had written to her own mother, my grandmother, during her time in nursing school in New York. Mr. Finch had marked one. It was dated February 12th, 1969, just 2 days after Genevieve's entry. I unfolded the delicate, brittle paper and read the words my mother had written over half a century ago. "Dearest Mom, you won't believe the week I've had. I found a woman collapsed in the snow outside our building. She was so sick, I thought she might die. We brought her in, and she's been staying with us. She won't say much about her past, but there is such a deep sadness in her eyes." I read on, my heart pounding, until I reached the final paragraph. "And Mom, this is going to sound crazy, so please don't tell anyone, but I think she's Adrian, Aunt Catherine's youngest daughter, the one who disappeared after her family died in that car crash 2 years ago. The family thinks she's dead, but I see Aunt Catherine in her face, in her eyes. She calls herself Genevieve now. I won't let on that I know. She has lost so much already. The last thing she needs is to lose her pride. She deserves to tell her own story, in her own time. For now, I will just be her friend. I will help her find her way back to the light." I dropped the letter onto the desk, a choked gasp escaping my lips. My mother had known. She had known all along. She hadn't just saved a stranger. She had knowingly and secretly saved her own cousin, a member of her own family that everyone else had given up for dead. She had done it without seeking credit, without revealing the truth, purely to protect the dignity of a woman who had lost everything. Genevieve had lived the rest of her life, believing she had been saved by a chance encounter, a random act of kindness. But it wasn't random. It was family. It was a secret, profound act of love, a circle of compassion so much deeper and more powerful than I could ever have imagined. I looked out the window at the New York skyline, but I wasn't seeing the buildings. I was seeing my mother, a young nursing student, making a choice, a choice to offer kindness without condition, to love without expectation. I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't the money. The real inheritance was this story. It was the legacy of quiet, selfless compassion that flowed in my blood. It was the sacred duty that had been passed from my mother to Genevieve, and now to me. By the end of the 5th year, the Clara's Circle Foundation had helped 103 women begin new lives. I stood in the penthouse my great aunt had left me, looking out at the endless river of lights that was New York City, and I finally understood the true nature of my inheritance. The money was just the key. The real gift was the door. It opened a door back to myself, back to a life of purpose. My journey took me to the darkest, most desperate places, both on the streets and within my own heart. But it was in that darkness that I learned what it truly means to see the light in another human being. We all carry a story, and sometimes, through no fault of our own, that story gets torn, tattered, and thrown away. We become invisible. But what I've learned is that no story is ever truly over, as long as there is someone willing to help write the next chapter. The world tells you that your worth is tied to your home, your job, your bank account. I am here to tell you that is a lie. I was never more myself than when I had nothing left to lose, sharing a piece of bread with a crying stranger. My mother's kindness to her long-lost cousin 50 years ago wasn't an investment that paid dividends. It was an act of pure, selfless love that sent ripples across time, saving a woman she didn't know she was related to, who in turn saved me, and who has allowed my daughter and me to save so many others. That is how the world truly changes. Not with grand gestures or billion-dollar bailouts, but with one person reaching out to another, creating a chain of compassion that cannot be broken. We are all just one crisis away from needing a helping hand. And we are all just one act of kindness away from being the person who offers it. If this story has touched your heart, if it has made you think differently about the people you pass on the street, then please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear a message of hope. Real change begins when we learn to see the humanity in everyone, recognizing that each person is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Please comment below with your own stories of unexpected kindness, of a time when a helping hand made all the difference in your life. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the unbreakable bonds we all share. Thank you for listening. And remember, be kind. The life you save might one day be your own.